Welcome. Thank you so much for listening to this broadcast. I really appreciate it. I know in the times that we're living, we're all kind of interacting a different way, and I appreciate you spending some time, maybe the next 30 to 45 minutes, to learn a little bit about gardening. Today, we're going to be discussing screening plants for privacy. I think, sometimes we often want to kind of create our own little backyard oasis, and part of that is, just using plants in appropriate situations to kind of give yourself a little bit, but maybe not a full barrier, but a little bit of a barrier between the neighbors. Maybe just block off a patio to their bedroom window or something like that. So before we get too far, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Kathleen Carr. I own a company called The Growing Scene. We've been in business now for 25 years. We're a garden center and landscape company located in Marengo. So last night, I spent some time with my family around a bonfire. It's a bonfire that we had been talking about for a while, and we just kind of set aside last night to do that. And of course, we're focusing on the bonfire and roasting marshmallows, but really what I found myself doing is looking around in the backyard and realizing that through planting specific plants in specific areas over the last 20 years, we've really been able to kind of create that privacy in our backyard that we've been wanting, and it just made that bonfire even more enjoyable because we were able to to plant a series of shrubs and trees to create that private oasis that I had mentioned. So normally I am teaching these classes, kind of the typical stand up in the front of the classroom and kind of go through a series of PowerPoint slides. However, I'm not able to do that this year, so I hope you guys can just kind of sit back, and whether you're watching this on a tablet or a computer, just kind of enjoy it and know that I am very thankful that you've decided to spend some time with me in this format. I apologize that I can't hear what you're hoping to achieve through watching this, but I hope no matter what you're looking for that you find some inspiration and some ideas as we go through the next in about 30 slides or so. So as far as getting into some specifics of planting shrubs or trees for privacy, what I would encourage you to do is, if possible, purchase the largest size plants that are feasible, one, in your budget, and then two, that are available. You may want a 6 foot, if it's 6 foot shrub, but it may only typically be available in a 3 foot. So just based on availability and based on your budget, I would encourage you to, to buy the largest plants that are possible. You'd also want to think about, obviously trees in particular can be incredibly heavy, and it just may not be realistic that you could buy a 15-foot evergreen tree, but definitely a good 6 or 7 foot tall evergreen tree may do what you want it to do. It just may take a little bit of time to get there. I would also, so if you can, purchase the largest size possible, but then I would also think through to what that 6 foot shrub, for instance, is going to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 12 years. You really want to make a point to do a little bit of research, find out the mature height and width on either the shrubs or the trees that you're considering planting, and making sure that you allow for that future growth. Unfortunately, if you don't allow for that future growth, at some point the tree or shrub may just outgrow its space and may need to be cut down entirely, or certainly if you've planted something that's going to get way too tall for a particular area, you may have to start pruning it on a regular basis, and then that adds to the cost as well as eating away at your time. Oftentimes we're trying to achieve a low maintenance landscape, and that isn't done by planting things in incorrect spots. So just do a little bit of research ahead of time, and I think that you will you will be more happy with the result. The other thing to consider is I'm just really trying to consider the whole design aspect of what you're planting. Not only choose plants correctly, but then think about how you're going to lay them out. Personally, I tend as a designer to to stagger things rather than just kind of putting them in a row like soldiers. And then oftentimes if I'm staggering the deciduous shrubs or even some evergreen shrubs, I'll work in some plants to soften the corners or soften the edges, and whether those are ornamental grasses or perennials, you just try to work with the different heights and colors and textures to create that more natural effect instead of trying to plant a living fence per se. Maybe just a few correctly placed shrubs and then a series of other perennial flowers or ornamental grasses will kind of give you that overall screening effect that you're trying to find. The other thing I would consider is you don't necessarily need a lot of plants to provide the screening. Many trees in particular grow in a multi-stem or a clump version. What that means is it's a tree that is a multi-stem, or it's also called a clump. It doesn't have one single trunk as we normally think of a tree, but it would have multi-trunks coming out from really close to the ground. And multi-stem trees really can give you a lot of privacy. There's a couple of examples on this screen. Birch is probably the most common example of a multi-stem tree, but there's also serviceberry or crabs. There's quite a few different multi-stem trees. There's even some multi-stem pear trees. I had mentioned last night I was sitting at a bonfire. We have two, in one of the areas that I was looking at in our yard, we have two multi-stem pear trees that I really like that work to kind of screen off a back corner of our home. And the other thing that I would consider is when you're choosing where to plant something in your yard, I would really take a look at it from a couple of different vantage points. Maybe take a look at it from your living room window, from your bedroom window, and really kind of pinpoint exactly what you are trying to hide or the view that you're trying to interrupt. The example cited here is if you wanted to enjoy your morning coffee, but the neighbors that drive by are going to see you drinking your morning coffee, and you'd really like to be able to read your paper in your own private secluded corner, then I would kind of take a look at what is the sight line between any passing cars and yourself, and you may not be able to block yourself off entirely, but perhaps just a couple of shrubs planted will give you the feeling of privacy, and then will give the people that are driving by in their cars something else to look at, mainly beautiful flowering shrubs and not yourself. A little bit more thought on the design, especially if you have kind of a narrow area and perhaps on the sides of your home. I would consider going vertical with some privacy design aspect. Obviously, trellises are a great vertical accent that provide you a lot of privacy. And there's many different vines or climbing plants that can really be planted on a trellis and provide you that privacy. The one thing that I would mention about trellises, though, is if you want to use a trellis, kind of that one of the first slides I said, buy the biggest, plant that you can to provide you with the privacy as soon as possible. When you work with the trellis, I would buy the, kind of the strongest, not largest trellis, but a larger trellis, because I guess the one mistake I see people making is, planting say a clematis that can easily get up to 8 foot tall, planting it on a trellis that's only 3 foot, 3 foot high. So vines tend to outgrow their trellis, and I'd really make it a point to buy a pretty substantial trellis to make sure that you've kind of planned for the years of growth on that vine. There's also some columnar shape evergreens that are listed here that really work well in small or narrow spaces. Junipers, yews, arborvitae can work well. Although that being said, there's many different types of junipers, yews, and arborvitaes. You want to make sure that you know what specific cultivar you are planting and what the mature height and width is. So instead of maybe trying to screen something off, you could just try to redirect attention through that. So if I guess I'll give you an example. In our front yard, we live out in the country, so we have a sump pump. We have a septic head in the front of our home. There is nothing that I can do that can take away from the septic head area in our front yard. But what we've done instead is, I can't screen it very well because it's about 24 inches out of the ground. But a little ways away from there, I planted a really compact crab tree with some ornamental grasses. So instead of people driving by my front yard and maybe even knowing that there's a septic head or a well head there, instead, in the spring, they see the bright white flowers of the Tina crabtree that I planted, and then a little bit more in the summer and even into the fall, they see the ornamental grasses that we've planted. So it's just something to, to kind of draw their eye away from the wellhead. You could also use, a flowering pot of annuals, maybe a water feature, just something else to draw their eye away from what you don't want people to be focusing on in your yard. So before you actually get into purchasing the plants, I would encourage you to just do a little bit of research on the plants that you're considering using. And then these are just 5 ideas of where you could do that research at. So 1, just check with the local garden center, kind of get their opinion on what other homeowners in the area have used successfully. The other thing you can do, especially in this time that we're all quarantining, is just take walks, and on your walks really look at what shrubs and trees your neighbors have planted and see if they will work in your yard as well. That's kind of, take number 2 and 3 really tie into each other. Also look at other yards in your neighborhood, in the wider neighborhood area, maybe as you're driving around, to see what has worked. A lot of us have access, obviously, through the internet to a whole bevy of information on the internet. And I would just check, again, just do a little bit of research, check on the websites of local nurseries to see what's available. And then I would always encourage you to know that there is a series of people who are called master gardeners that are available at your local extension office. Obviously this year it's a little bit different. You can't just pop in and say hello, but you may want to email or perhaps call and see if they have any information that they can give you about plants that would be good for screening. So to get beyond the design and kind of the thought process, to get into some specific plants that you may want to consider when trying to screen something, we'll just jump right into one called Wine and Roses Weigelia. You can tell it has a beautiful pink trumpet-shaped flower in the spring. It has a purple leaf spring, summer, and fall. Those flowers are really, kind of all over. They're very prolific bloomer, generally mid-May to mid-June. They do well in full sun. For a Weigelia, it's a pretty compact plant, and it does well in mass plantings. One thing I would mention about this plant, it is deciduous. What that means is it will lose its leaves in the fall. So although it does do a great job of screening, perhaps in the spring, summer, and into the fall, the branching structure is not, I wouldn't say it's particularly sufficient if you wanted some like year-round coverage. It's not an evergreen shrub, and it wouldn't give you that year-round coverage. This is called Miss Kim Lilac. You can see it's got just loads of beautiful kind of pale purple flowers to it. It is considered a dwarf lilac. That being said, Miss Kim can, pretty easily get up to 6 foot tall and even a little bit beyond that. It is a very full, almost round lilac. The one thing I would point out about this is if you do need to prune it, I would only prune it after it's done flowering. So generally, I would say mid to late June, just whenever it's done pruning, or whenever it's done flowering, then you can prune it. And I really do like Miss Kim lilacs. I just know that you need to give them a little bit of room because they can get, pretty tall. The one thing that I guess I frequently forget about Miss Kim lilacs is they have a really nice, deep purple color to the foliage in the fall. It's not quite as attractive as the flowers in the spring, but absolutely beautiful in the fall. This plant that's listed here is called First Edition's Amber Jubilee 9-bark. You can see underneath that it says Physocarpus obuliflorus jeffum. The difference between those two names is the first name is the common name, the second name is the botanical name. The First Edition's portion of that name of Amber Jubilee 9-bark means that it's part of a series of plants that is grown at Bailey Nursery. This is when it comes to the First Edition's kind of portion of the name or tag in the name, it means that it's kind of their best out of the best. Bailey Nursery is a wholesale nursery out of Minnesota, and they have been growing plants. I think they're in their 5th generation of nurserymen, and they've whenever they have feel confident in a plant to name it part of their First Editions program, it's a great plant. I like Amber Jubilee because it has what looks like fall color foliage, but it's all it's spring, summer, and fall. So even in the spring, you'll get that really nice, kind of golden caramel color to the leaf. It does have a white flower. I don't think of the white flower as particularly showy. It's really, 9-bark are typically grown for the color and the foliage and not so much for the flower. It is I would say it's a pretty carefree plant, pretty insect resistant, disease resistant. Although I have seen some powdery mildew on 9-barks. Amber Jubilee, I have not seen a lot on Amber Jubilee itself. This is a perennial flower, and I know it's pretty unusual to think of a perennial flower as a plant that will give you a lot of screening, but when you take a look at the height and the width, you can understand that Baptisia absolutely does that. This particular one is called Twilight Prairie Blues False Indigo, or it's also called Baptisia. I really like kind of the purple stalks of flowers on the plant. And what you can see a little bit in this slide, but maybe it's not completely evident, is that it also has a really pretty kind of blue-gray roundish leaf to the plant. After it's done blooming, it really seems more shrub-like rather than a perennial flower, and it really does stay in that nice full about 3.5 foot tall throughout the whole rest of the summer. Typically it would get cut down in the fall, though. Kind of an added benefit to Baptisia is it is rabbit resistant and drought tolerant, so it really is kind of a plant it and forget it type perennial flower. So on the upper right-hand side, that actually is a vine growing around the mailbox. It's a vine called Sweet Autumn Clematis. I think we're mostly familiar with the clematis. It has a purple flower in the summer. This actually has, you can see, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of white star-shaped flowers in the fall. It is also a fragrant flower. It is a really nice, as the name implies, kind of a sweet odor to the flower. This is so you can see this is a picture of a series of arborvitae that were used to screen what, to me, it looks like maybe it's pool equipment, or maybe there's a series of air conditioners. I guess the arborvitae are doing such a good job that we don't actually know what's behind them. Holmstrup is is a more compact version of an arborvitae. They're only going to get about 6 foot tall, 3 foot wide. That being said, it's hard to find them, of substantial size. Usually they're sold about 3 or 4 foot to begin with. They would typically do better with a little bit of sun, although I have arborvitae planted on the north side of my home, and it's pretty shady, and they've done just fine. The one thing I would say about arborvitae is that oftentimes they lose their inner needles in the fall. So if that would start to happen, just know that it's pretty typical of arborvitae. If they start getting brown around the edges, that's when I would be a little bit worried. But they will kind of annually shed those inner needles. This is another type of arborvitae, probably the more common version. It's called Techne. Arborvitae holmstrop from the previous slide would be the more dwarf or compact version of Techne. Techne is absolutely going to grow, to that full kind of 11, 12 foot height range, 4 foot wide, but a really, really nice, full, dense plant to give you a lot of privacy. It is a hardy version of a evergreen shrub. What that means is typically, is it going to live from year to year? Will it make it through the winter? And Techne absolutely does make it through the winter. Even when we got that the polar vortex a couple of years ago, most Technes made it through the winter just fine. This is, for many years, this was kind of my go-to, if we're trying to screen something off, this was my go-to arborvitae, but I do appreciate that there are more compact versions now. And this is one that's a little bit more compact. So it's called emerald green arborvitae, or smaragd arborvitae is the other trade name. You can see that the two previous, holmstrop and Techne, were more pyramidal in shape. This is more columnar. It can get pretty tall, but it's also pretty narrow. I do like smaragd a lot. The one thing, though, that can happen is when we get a lot of snow cover, because it has multiple leaders. It has, if you maybe kind of envision a birch tree where there's multiple stems coming up from the bottom on a birch tree, this also has that. Whereas the two previous arborvitae, the smaragd and Techne, just had one main trunk. This has multiple trunks. And sometimes those can tend to split with a heavy, heavy snow load throughout the winter. This smaragd, though, what I like about it is you can, really plant them, I would say about, as close as 3 foot on center. So from the center of one to the center of the next, you can really kind of get that instant screen with them because you can plant them so close. Moving on to another deciduous plant. This is called dwarf burning bush, Euonymus compactus. This is a really pretty tolerant plant. You can plant it for anything from full sun to full shade. Typically, the dwarf burning bush will get around 6 to 8 foot or so. If you can plant it in full shade, it should still live. But it may not get that really bright fall color and shade. It is a very dense plant. One of the first plants that we talked about were the Weigelia, and I said, when it loses its leaves, probably not going to give you a lot of screening. The burning bush, on the other hand, has what's called winged or corky bark. So even in the winter, it's a densely branched plant, and I would consider that this is a plant that can continue to give you that privacy even 12 months out of the year when it does not have the leaves on it. The one thing that I would encourage you to be aware of, though, unfortunately, with the burning bush, is they are very susceptible to rabbit damage. So I would keep an eye on them, especially in the winter, and protect them from the rabbit damage in the winter as much as you can. So this is called big blue stem, or Andropogon red October. It is an ornamental. So ornamental grasses, I think, can be used for screening. I would, though, just remember that ornamental grasses typically only, kind of achieve that 5 to 6 feet on this one, really late summer through early spring. Then they're cut back and they grow up from the bottom. So yes, ornamental grasses can give you that screening, but it's really only for, maybe, half the year, if that. I like this particular one, honestly, because partly, because of what's indicated by the name. It has a really bright red stems bright red blades to the grass in the fall. Maiden grass, or Miscanthus adiago, is another great ornamental grass. I love kind of just the airy seed heads that are present, and I would say late September into early October. Really kind of a light grass that kind of echoes the wind. There's a note here that is a warm season grass, and it's also clump forming. What those phrases mean is warm season grass means that you're probably not going to see a lot of growth from this miscanthus until the ground starts to warm up, maybe even into late May, early June. What clump forming means is that if you were to plant, say, a 1 gallon grass, over time that grass will get wider. It doesn't send out rhizomes, so it's not a spreading type grass, but the clump will just get wider over. So we talked about Miss Kim lilac. This is another dwarf lilac. It's called dwarf Korean lilac. It will ultimately get a similar height to Miss Kim, maybe just a little bit smaller. What's unique about this is it's got smaller flowers and smaller leaves, and it grows just a little bit slower than Miss Kim, but a really nice, dense, very fragrant lilac. It does have good mildew resistance. Some of the old-fashioned lilacs really tended to get kind of a gray, powdery mildew on their leaves midsummer. This one does not. Here's another ornamental grass called Morning Light. You can see just by the picture perhaps why it's called that, because it just kind of radiates that light color. It does have a green blades with a white midrib. It also turns kind of a little bit of a wheat color in the fall. All ornamental grasses are typically cut down early spring. I usually say mid to late March. Just so that they do have a little bit of winter interest, so you can continue to appreciate them in the winter. Pictured here are 3 Green Mountain boxwood. You can tell that they're a pyramidal evergreen. They're in a family of evergreens called a broadleaf evergreen. They have a green, kind of flat, glossy leaf to them. Just a really nice, so I would say a slow-growing, pretty compact evergreen shrub. Ivory halo dogwood, there's a couple of different pictures here. On the bottom left, that's typically what this particular dogwood would look like in the winter. It has a bright red stems, or they're also called canes. In the top right, that's what it would look like in the summer. It has a light green leaf with a white edge to it. I think I like Ivory Halo 1 because it's a variegated version of a dogwood, and I also like it because it's a more compact version. A lot of the dogwoods can really, get, I would say, closer to that 6 to 8 foot, and you can see this is much more compact than that. So there's a whole family of hydrangeas called panicle hydrangeas. Pinky Winky is, I would say, one of maybe the medium height and width of those hydrangeas. Pinky Winky starts out with a white flower that over time matures to kind of a mauve color. The flowers are huge, about a foot in length, and just a really nice kind of dense or a thick leaf to them, almost leafed all the way down to the ground. So it would provide you kind of that every bit of that 6 or 7 foot privacy on this panicle hydrangea. This is called snowball bush. It's a little bit more of kind of an old-fashioned plant, or Viburnum opulus roseum. You can see that, if you were to plant a couple of these, you really need to give them a lot of space because they can get them, about 9 foot tall, 9 foot wide. I would say these are more typical towards the back of your property, maybe to the sides of your property. Just make sure to allow enough room so that it's not growing onto your neighbor's property. It can be pretty severely pruned back. They do take pruning well, and if you needed to prune this, I would say you could safely take off about 1/3 of the height every time that you prune them. I would encourage you to only prune them usually in about mid-June after they're done flowering. This one does have a nice fruit more towards the late fall. This is called Autumn Blaze Maple. It's, I would say, a relatively fast-growing maple, maybe like medium to fast. It is a cross between a sugar maple and a silver maple. Sorry about that. I like Autumn Blaze because it will tolerate the wet soils, and unfortunately there are a lot of wet soils this year. It also has a pretty compact, kind of more upright branching structure. It has, as you can tell by the picture, just a really bright red fall color to it. So I've talked about birches, cited them in a couple of different examples. This is an example of a Cully or heritage river birch. It has that really nice cinnamon peeling bark to it. Doesn't get quite as tall as some of the river birch cultivars, and a little bit more compact at 40 foot, although certainly that is pretty tall. It will take the wet soils and just really kind of a versatile plant that will take just about whatever kind of weather conditions are thrown at it. So this is another upright evergreen. It's called Blue Point Juniper. Some people don't find junipers all that palatable. I really do like Blue Point though because of the bright blue color to the needles. It is pretty densely branched upright juniper. So that is kind of an overview of a couple of different plants that you could consider for areas in your yard if you want to do any screening. And here's just some examples of questions that you may want to ask before you do any purchasing. So number one, why do I want to plant? What do I want these plants to accomplish? So what are you trying to screen? What is the end goal here? Maybe is there a specific line of sight that you're trying to alter? Where do I want to plant these shrubs? What type of light will these plants receive? Typically, if they're on the north or the east side of your home, it's going to be a little bit shadier, or south or west will be a little bit sunnier. And then I would really be honest with yourself. What type of care will you be able to give these plants? Number 6, what plants will work best with the surroundings? I would definitely take a look at everything in your planting site that you're considering. I would take a look at where your property lines are. I would take a look at where the neighbors' homes are situated. Just really kind of think things through. Number 7, what plants do I not like? I had mentioned that there's a particular juniper that I like, but that some people don't find junipers. Actually, most people don't find junipers all that palatable. If you don't like junipers, do not plant it no matter what I say about it. I planted junipers, I don't know, probably like 15 years ago in my yard, and I planted them actually in an area where I don't have to go close to them, and they're literally probably 50 or 60 feet from my house, and I actually like them when I can view them from so far away. And they're planted under a birch tree, and I think it just works. What plants do I like? If there's something that you really like, I would put a lot of credence in that. And then from whose view am I trying to improve? Maybe it's a neighbor's. Maybe you have, like a seat wall next to your patio, and you just want to plant some flowers near that seat wall. They're flowers that you're never going to see because they're on you would rarely see because they're on the other side of the seat wall, but you wanted to give your neighbor something pretty to look at. And then number 10, it took me a long time to think that I should be asking myself this question. What is above the area where I want to plant? So I mentioned my own yard and the junipers. We have above ground utilities running next to our house, and I planted that birch tree actually that I mentioned. I planted it underneath some utility lines, and unfortunately the utility company has come and cut that birch tree a couple of times, and it's looking a bit awkward now. So I would consider that maybe the more appropriate example to bring out is there are some homes in the area that have very wide overhangs, even like 24-inch overhangs. So I've come to realize that if we plant plants that are underneath the overhang, that they rarely get natural rainwater, and those plants tend to dry out. So just pay attention, especially if you're planting close to your house, what's above that planting area. I apologize that I cannot answer any questions. However, if you do have any questions, my contact information was at the beginning of this presentation, and you are welcome to reach out, and I will try my best to answer the questions for you. There are going to be a whole series of classes that I will be recording in this format. If you have a chance in the next week or couple of weeks, I will be speaking on maintaining your paver sidewalks, some native plants, rabbit-resistant plants, growing vegetables on your patio. So feel free to tune back in and take a listen. Thank you very, very much for attending. I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.